what is your, I guess, SparkNotes version of how to fix the Republican Party in 2025?
Oh, I have no idea in 2025. I'm playing the long game. And I'm not saying there's no answer, but I genuinely think reform is going to be slow and painful. The number one thing that could fix either party is if they have such a decisive loss that there's no question they were roundly rejected, well beyond what the Democrats experienced in 2024, although that could be helpful. And even then, it's no guarantee that they would swing back the other way. I don't know how it gets fixed with Donald Trump in the mix, or at least so long as he continues to be the kingmaker that he is and can have these threats of just pulling down people that he gets irked with. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's hard for me to see how you do that. I am hopeful there's enough muscle memory through the many years of the Republican Party that maybe some people will rekindle older versions, although I want to be clear here. The reason we got Trump was partially because the Republican Party was imperfect and needed reformation. So my desire is not just to go back to 2015 and pretend like nothing ever happened. That's a whole maybe hour-long conversation exactly what that would look like for another time, because you asked for the Cliff Notes version. But I think that is a dang good question I don't have a good answer to. I think through process of time, it may be a bit more evident. What I'm trying to do in the meanwhile is consistently share a conservative message, if you will, of where these ideas came from, here's how they were utilized, here's why they're important, in the hopes that I really think those are the building blocks necessary to eventually get to a reformed GOP.
You know, when Donald Trump came to power, I was a socialist. And when I came out of socialism and started exploring different ideas, I still wouldn't call myself a conservative, but I started really, really appreciating like the National Review and these types of traditional, conservative publications and thinkers. And, I guess I have kind of a bitter taste of conservatism in my mouth when I think about the MAGA movement. But then I read these type of, different conservative, like high-minded conservative intellectuals. And I think, gosh, there really is something here. And I have to believe there's probably a lot of other people that think there's something to this. It would be worth at least a look of returning back to this thing that was prior to Trump.
I hope so. I think the sad reality is oftentimes the story we conservatives tell ourselves, and there's truth in it, is that conservatism begins as this ragtag intellectual group in the 90s as in a lot of ways a response to the excesses of the New Deal. And it goes into hyperdrive under LBJ in the response to the Great Society. And you eventually get with the culmination of, prior to LBJ, you get Goldwater, an imperfect figure to be sure, but someone who is arguably a pretty libertarian/conservative candidate, more so than we had seen in the past. Eventually you get Ronald Reagan. And you tell the story of William F. Buckley, National Review, and all that. The tragedy is that you also in that mix have your John Birch Society. You also have your Father Coughlin's. You also have essentially proto-MAGA elements that in a lot of ways were more powerful and boisterous and larger than these individuals that I hope to emulate and look up to. Imperfect, but look up to in a lot of ways. And I think we may have taken it for granted that what MAGAism represents is that same sort of excess that had always been there. When you don't have a Ronald Reagan and you end up with a Donald Trump, it turns out, that those are two possible responses the right can generate. Maybe there's 1,000 responses they could generate, but those are at least two I'm aware of. And so I think it is conceivably possible that we can have better leaders in the future. I think it's also possible that, historically speaking, just as you were saying, you kind of read the National Review and the history of where we came from. It wasn't always bright and sunny, but thankfully there was an era when those more high-minded individuals prevailed. And they're able to tamp down, if you will, those excesses. And you can even look back in history and say, well, maybe they didn't do it well. Maybe they were willing to countenance too much of the John Birch Society, or too many of these, what would you call that, the McCarthyites, if you will, because we were all sort of on the same side, or at least we had the same political opponents. And there again, that's where statesmanship comes into play, right? You've got to be cautious. Sometimes, in order to win in politics, you have to form coalitions with individuals who you recognize we don't agree on all things.